Throughout the Northwest Europe campaign from June 1944 to May 1945, American intelligence officers conducted thousands of prisoner-of-war interrogations. The interrogation reports, now preserved in National Archives records, reveal a consistent and striking pattern. When German soldiers were asked what weapon they feared most, the overwhelming answer was American artillery. Not American tanks, not American air power. Artillery. The fear was documented in tactical behavior as well as words. German units developed elaborate procedures to avoid American artillery observation. They moved primarily at night when observation aircraft could not see them. They dispersed forces to avoid presenting concentrated targets. They limited artillery activity to brief missions followed by immediate displacement. German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive sound of American L-4 Cub observation aircraft and would immediately take cover when they heard the high-pitched engine overhead, knowing that artillery fire would arrive within minutes. American artillery was different. Not because American guns were better, they were not. The German 105mm and 155mm pieces were excellent weapons, comparable or superior to American guns in range and destructive power. The difference was not in the hardware. The difference was in how American artillery operated as a system that German soldiers learned to fear above all other weapons on the battlefield. This fear was documented repeatedly in prisoner interrogations conducted throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. German prisoners of war interviewed in France from June through August 1944 frequently mentioned American artillery as the most frightening weapon they had encountered. The interrogation reports, preserved in National Archives records, show a consistent pattern. Germans described artillery fire that arrived with no warning, no ranging shots, no time to take cover. Fire that landed precisely on their positions even when those positions were concealed, recently occupied, or far from obvious target reference points. One Wehrmacht soldier captured near St. Lo in July 1944 told interrogators that American artillery felt like fighting an enemy who could see everything and shoot at everything simultaneously. He said German units learned to recognize the sound of the Piper L-4 Cub aircraft, the small observation planes that American artillery battalions used for forward observation. When the Cub appeared, German soldiers knew they had approximately 3 minutes before artillery fire would arrive. Not random suppressive fire, but accurate concentrated fire precisely on their positions. The timing was so consistent that German company commanders began keeping stopwatches to measure the interval between Cub sighting and first round's landing. The average was 3 minutes and 10 seconds. The speed shocked German artillery officers who understood the complexities of computing firing data. In the German system, a battery receiving a fire mission would require 12 to 15 minutes to calculate elevation, deflection, and charge settings for each gun. The calculations involved range tables, protractors, and slide rules. Every variable from wind speed to barrel wear had to be factored individually. Under combat conditions, with incomplete meteorological data or disrupted communications, the process could take 20 minutes or longer. The idea that Americans could receive coordinates, compute firing data for multiple batteries, coordinate simultaneous impact, and execute the fire mission in 3 minutes seemed impossible, but the Americans were doing it consistently. And the explanation lay in an innovation developed at the United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, during the interwar period. The innovation was called the Fire Direction Center. The concept emerged from careful analysis of World War I artillery operations. American artillery officers studying the Great War recognized that artillery had been the decisive weapon, causing more casualties than any other arm. But they also recognized profound inefficiency. Massive ammunition expenditures produced limited results. The problem was not the guns, which were reasonably effective. The problem was coordination and fire control. Artillery in World War I operated largely at the battery level, with individual battery commanders controlling their own guns and computing their own firing data. Massing fire from multiple batteries required elaborate pre-planning and was rarely achieved against targets of opportunity. Major Carlos Brewer, serving as director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill from 1929 through 1933, began developing solutions. Brewer introduced a firing chart system that simplified target location and improved coordination. Instead of computing every element from scratch, batteries could plot their position and target position on a standardized chart overlaid with reference data. The chart made it easier to visualize spatial relationships between guns and targets and simplified communication of firing data. Brewer also developed survey procedures that allowed batteries to know their precise location, eliminating one major source of aiming error. But Brewer could not solve the fundamental problem of firing data computation. Even with improved charts and survey techniques, the mathematical calculations required to convert target coordinates into gun settings remained complex and time-consuming. The breakthrough came under Brewer's successor, Major Orlando Ward, who served as director of the gunnery department from 1932 through 1934. Ward developed the concept of centralized fire direction at the battalion level. Instead of each battery commander computing firing data independently, Ward created a battalion fire direction center that controlled all guns in the battalion simultaneously. The fire direction center received fire missions from forward observers, computed firing data, and transmitted gun settings to all batteries. This centralization enabled true massing of fires. Multiple batteries could engage the same target with minimal delay, and fire could be shifted rapidly from one target to another as the tactical situation changed. The system was demonstrated publicly in the spring of 1931. The gunnery department successfully massed battalion fire using centralized fire direction, showing that multiple batteries could be coordinated to deliver simultaneous fire on a single target. The demonstration impressed visiting officers and validated the concept. Over the next decade, fire direction center procedures were refined and standardized. By the time the United States entered World War II, battalion-level fire direction centers were doctrine throughout the field artillery branch. But the system still required complex calculations. Fire direction officers spent years learning to use tabular firing tables, voluminous books that listed firing data for thousands of possible combinations of range, meteorological conditions, and projectile characteristics. Finding the correct data in the tables was time-consuming, and interpolating between listed values required mathematical skill. The system worked, but it was slow. The final breakthrough came in November 1940, when Captain Abbott Harrington Burns, serving at Fort Sill, invented the graphical firing table. Burns created the device literally overnight, working through the night to develop a solution to what he called the slow torture of intricate mathematics. The graphical firing table was essentially a specialized slide rule printed on a transparent sheet. Fire direction officers could lay the sheet on their firing chart, align it with the battery and target positions, and read firing data directly without calculation. The device made computation more than 20 times faster and allowed enlisted soldiers with basic arithmetic skills to perform calculations that previously required trained officers. The graphical firing table revolutionized American artillery. By 1942, when American forces entered combat in North Africa, every artillery battalion had fire direction centers equipped with graphical firing tables. The combination of centralized control and rapid computation created the 3-minute response time that so shocked German opponents. An observer could call in target coordinates, the fire direction center could compute and distribute firing data, and multiple batteries could be shooting within 3 minutes. No other army in World War II could match that speed. The system enabled something the Americans called time-on-target missions. In a time-on-target mission, guns from multiple batteries across several kilometers would fire at different times, with the firing times carefully calculated so that all shells arrived over the target within a 3-second window. The effect was devastating. Instead of shells arriving sequentially, giving soldiers time to take cover after the first explosions, every round impacted simultaneously. The entire bombardment occurred in an instant, before anyone could react. Most casualties in artillery bombardments occur in the first few seconds before troops go prone or find cover. Time-on-target missions maximized casualties by compressing the entire fire mission into those critical first seconds. German artillery could not execute time-on-target missions against targets of opportunity. The coordination required was beyond the capability of their decentralized battery-level fire control system. Germans could execute simultaneous fires if they had days to prepare, carefully surveying positions and pre-computing all firing data. But they could not do it on 3 minutes' notice against an unexpected target. British artillery was more sophisticated than German, with excellent training and equipment. British artillery officers developed elaborate fire planning procedures that allowed impressive concentrations of fire. By 1941, Brigadier Jack Parham had demonstrated the ability to coordinate 144 guns in a divisional concentration delivered within 5 minutes of the fire call. British artillery used a system of standardized concentrations they called Mike, Uncle, Victor, and William targets, with each designation representing a different scale of massed fire. But British procedures were different from American time-on-target techniques. British concentrations achieved rapid massing of fire, but did not emphasize simultaneous impact the way American procedures did. British doctrine accepted shells arriving over a short time period rather than insisting on the 3-second window that Americans achieved. The difference was subtle but significant in terms of casualty effectiveness. Soviet artillery operated on a completely different philosophy. The Red Army possessed enormous numbers of guns and used them for massive preparatory bombardments that lasted hours and consumed staggering quantities of ammunition. At Kursk, in July 1943, Soviet artillery fired over 1.6 million shells in the opening bombardment. The sheer volume of fire was devastating and played a crucial role in breaking German attacks. But Soviet fire control remained relatively primitive throughout the war. Soviet batteries typically fired at area targets or pre-plotted coordinates, without the precise adjustment that characterized American artillery. Russian shells often landed scattered across hundreds of meters, and instances of friendly fire from inaccurate artillery were not uncommon. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower through quantity rather than precision. The approach was effective. In the massive battles of the Eastern Front, where targets were often large concentrations of troops and vehicles, but it lacked the flexibility and precision of the American system. The American approach to artillery was based on flexibility and responsiveness, and this approach was enabled by an extensive forward observer system that no other army matched. American doctrine placed trained artillery observers at company level and below in infantry and armored units. These observers had direct radio communication with battalion fire direction centers and could call for fire on any target they identified. The observers were not simply spotters who reported target locations. They were trained artillery officers or non-commissioned officers who understood fire direction procedures and could work directly with fire direction centers to adjust fire and maximize effectiveness. Each American artillery battalion had a liaison section that provided forward observers to supported units. For a battalion supporting an infantry regiment, liaison officers would typically be assigned to each infantry battalion, with additional observers assigned down to company level as needed. The observers carried powerful radios that maintained reliable communication with fire direction centers, even in difficult terrain or under combat conditions. The SCR 610 radio, which became standard for forward observers in 1943, had a range of approximately 20 miles and was reliable enough that observers could maintain contact even when infantry units were cut off or surrounded. Forward observers were trained to locate targets accurately using maps and visual estimation. They carried plotting boards, compasses, and binoculars. A trained observer could estimate range to a target within 50 meters at distances up to 2,000 meters, sufficient accuracy for the fire direction center to compute effective firing data. The observers were also trained in adjustment procedures, calling corrections to walk artillery fire onto targets that were initially missed. The standard adjustment procedure used the clock system to describe target location relative to the impact of previous rounds. An observer might report target at 12 o'clock, 200 meters from the last impact, and the fire direction center would adjust fire accordingly. But the real revolution in forward observation came with the L-4 Cub aircraft. The L-4 was a military version of the Piper J-3 Cub, a small commercial aircraft. The military version was modified with larger tires for rough field operations, a transparent window in the roof for upward visibility, and radios for communication with ground units. The aircraft was powered by a 65-horsepower engine and had a maximum speed of 85 miles per hour. It could take off and land in incredibly short distances, typically less than 300 feet, allowing it to operate from rough forward airstrips close to the point. Front lines. The Army Air Forces had initially resisted organic aviation for the artillery, arguing that all aviation assets should be controlled by the Air Forces. But artillery officers argued that effective fire control required observers who understood artillery procedures and who were directly integrated into artillery command structures. After considerable bureaucratic conflict, the War Department approved organic field artillery aviation in 1942. Each artillery battalion received 2 L-4 aircraft and trained pilots who were artillery officers. The L-4s transformed artillery effectiveness. From an altitude of 1,000 to 1,500 feet, an aerial observer could see terrain for miles in every direction. Targets that would be completely invisible to ground observers, units enfilade behind hills, artillery positions hidden in tree lines, supply convoys moving on roads behind enemy lines, all were visible from the air. The aerial observer could identify targets, estimate their coordinates using maps and visual reference points, and call for fire directly to the Fire Direction Center. More than 5,400 L-4 aircraft were produced during the war, and more than 2,700 served with field artillery units in Europe. The presence of an L-4 overhead became a signature indicator that American artillery was active in the area. German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive sound of the Cub's small engine and to take cover immediately when they heard it. German tactical manuals from late 1944 included specific instructions for what to do when L-4 aircraft appeared. Units were ordered to cease movement, disperse to maximum extent possible, and take cover. The Germans understood that once the Cub spotted them, artillery fire would follow within minutes. German attempts to shoot down the L-4s were generally unsuccessful. The small aircraft flew low and slow, making them difficult targets for anti-aircraft guns designed to engage fast-moving fighters and bombers at high altitude. The L-4s were agile enough that pilots could see anti-aircraft fire and take evasive action. German fighters could catch the L-4s easily, but fighter patrols in forward areas were dangerous due to American air superiority, and German fighters tasked with intercepting Cubs often found themselves engaged by American fighter escorts. Many L-4 pilots flew their entire combat tours without being shot down, despite operating constantly over enemy territory. The L-4 pilots developed close working relationships with the fire direction centers they supported. A battalion aerial observer might fly daily missions with the same fire direction officer coordinating his fires. The team would develop efficient communication procedures, with the observer able to describe targets in shorthand that the fire direction officer understood immediately. The speed and accuracy of this coordination was extraordinary. An experienced aerial observer team could identify a target, call for fire, and have shells landing within 2 to 3 minutes. The observer would then adjust fire if needed, often achieving direct hits on small targets like individual vehicles or single artillery pieces. The psychological effect of the L-4s on German forces cannot be overstated. The constant presence of American observation aircraft meant German units could never feel safe, even in rear areas. Supply convoys had to move at night, or risk being spotted and destroyed. Artillery batteries had to remain under cover during daylight hours. Reserve units could not assemble in obvious locations. The L-4s forced German forces into a state of constant vigilance and limited their operational freedom during daylight hours. The integration of aerial observation with the Fire Direction Center system created a level of battlefield awareness that was unprecedented. Fire Direction Centers maintained detailed maps showing friendly unit positions, known enemy positions, suspected enemy locations, and no fire areas where friendly forces might be present. When an aerial observer reported a target, the Fire Direction Center could immediately evaluate whether the target was in a safe area for engagement, which batteries were in range, and how much fire was appropriate for the target type. The entire decision cycle, from target identification to rounds on target, could be completed in under 3 minutes for urgent targets. This flexibility was revolutionary. German doctrine assigned specific batteries to support specific units in rigid command relationships. A German infantry battalion might have a designated artillery battery in direct support, and that battery would fire missions for that battalion. But if the battalion needed more fire than one battery could provide, requesting additional support required coordination through higher headquarters, a time-consuming process. American forward observers could request fire from any battery in range, and the Fire Direction Center could mass fires from an entire corps artillery if the target warranted it. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, noted in his post-war memoir that the Fire Direction Center system allowed extraordinary concentrations of fire. During the Battle of the Bulge, artillery on the northern shoulder of the German penetration coordinated fire from 348 guns belonging to different divisions and corps. The guns were spread across dozens of kilometers, belonged to different units, but were all controlled through coordinated fire direction centers that could mass their fire on critical targets within minutes. The effectiveness of American artillery is documented in numerous battle accounts. At the Battle of Mortain in early August 1944, German forces launched Operation Luetich, a desperate counterattack attempting to cut off American forces that had broken out of Normandy. The attack began before dawn on August 7th, with German armor and infantry advancing rapidly in the pre-dawn darkness when American air superiority could not intervene. German commanders hoped to reach Avranches on the coast, cutting off Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army forces that had broken through into Brittany. The German attack initially made progress against surprised American units, but as daylight came, American artillery observers in L4 Cubs took to the air and began directing devastating fire onto German columns. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 30th Infantry Division, fired thousands of rounds throughout the day. Individual batteries fired so continuously that gun barrels overheated and had to be allowed to cool. Ammunition stocks were depleted and resupply trucks ran constantly between ammunition dumps and gun positions. The artillery fire was so accurate and so intense that German tank commanders reported being unable to maneuver. Every time German tanks attempted to advance or reposition, artillery fire would land precisely on their location within minutes. The combination of American artillery and fighter-bomber attacks, both directed by aerial observers who could see the entire battlefield, stopped the German offensive cold. By August 8th, it was clear the attack had failed. By August 10th, German forces were retreating, and what had been intended as a decisive counter-offensive had become a disaster as Allied forces encircled and destroyed much of the German 7th Army. Lieutenant Ralph Curley, commander of E Company, 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, directed artillery fire onto his own position when German forces attacked Hill 314 near Mortain. When the German 17th Panzer Grenadier Division assaulted E Company's perimeter just after 8 in the evening on August 7th, Curley called for artillery fire danger close to his own location. 84 howitzers delivered a devastating 5-minute barrage that broke the German attack. American soldiers found whatever cover they could to survive the friendly fire, while German attackers were unable to withstand the onslaught and retreated. Curley's willingness to accept artillery fire on his own position exemplified both the desperate nature of the fighting and the trust American forces had in their artillery system's precision. The fighting for Hill 192 near St. Lo in July 1944 showed similar artillery dominance. Hill 192 was a key terrain feature that dominated the approaches to St. Lo. German forces had fortified the hill with extensive trench systems, bunkers, and carefully sited weapons positions. American forces had attacked the hill repeatedly in late June and early July with limited success. German defenders had excellent fields of fire and could engage attacking American infantry at long range. The 2nd Infantry Division, tasked with capturing the hill, planned a deliberate attack supported by massive artillery preparation. Division artillery included 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers and 1 battalion of 155mm howitzers, a total of 48 guns. But the Fire Direction Center was able to call on additional support from corps artillery, bringing the total available firepower to more than 100 guns. The attack began on July 11th, 1944, after several days of preparation. American artillery fired 20 time-on-target missions during the night of July 10th to July 11th, each mission bringing massed fire from dozens of guns onto German defensive positions. The time-on-target missions were timed to prevent German defenders from resting or reorganizing. Every hour or two throughout the night, another massive bombardment would hit the German positions, preventing sleep and maintaining constant stress on the defenders. On July 11th, the main attack began with a thunderous artillery preparation. The 2nd Infantry Division's artillery fired 20,000 rounds that day alone, an average of more than 800 rounds per gun. The bombardment was so intense that German survivors reported complete disruption of command and control. Telephone lines were cut by the shelling, runners could not move between positions, and commanders lost contact with their subordinate units. When American infantry finally advanced behind the artillery preparation, German resistance was disorganized and ineffective. Hill 192 was captured by early afternoon on July 11th. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 to January 1945 provided another dramatic demonstration of American artillery effectiveness. When German forces launched their surprise offensive on December 16th, they achieved tactical surprise and made significant initial gains. But American artillery recovered from the initial shock within hours and began delivering coordinated fire across the entire front. On the northern shoulder of the German penetration, near Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery played the decisive role in stopping German attacks. The 1st Infantry Division and supporting units were backed by massed artillery that included divisional artillery, corps artillery, and even artillery from adjacent sectors that could range into the threatened area. The fire direction centers coordinated fire from 348 guns belonging to multiple divisions and corps. This concentration of firepower, controlled through coordinated fire direction, was possible only because of the American system. No other army could have rapidly organized such massive fire support. German infantry and armor attacking toward Elsenborn Ridge encountered devastating artillery fire that broke up every attack. German commanders reported that American artillery fire was so intense and so accurate that German forces could not maintain their attacks. Units that attempted to advance were hit by time-on-target missions that landed with no warning. Units that attempted to regroup in assembly areas found themselves under fire within minutes. The combination of accurate fire and rapid response made German offensive operations impossible. The 6th Panzer Army, the main German striking force in the northern sector, was stopped almost entirely by American artillery. German tank losses to artillery fire were so heavy that several panzer divisions reported losing more than half their armor. The German official history of the battle, compiled after the war, attributed the failure of the northern attack primarily to American artillery rather than to American armor or air power. In the southern sector of the Bulge, at Bastogne, American artillery again played the critical role in defense. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in Bastogne, was supported by artillery battalions that remained inside the pocket and by artillery firing from outside the encirclement. Forward observers with the paratroopers called for fire constantly, and fire direction centers coordinated responses from any guns that could range into the needed areas. German forces attacking Bastogne encountered the same pattern seen elsewhere during the Bulge. Advancing troops were hit by accurate massed artillery fire that arrived with devastating speed. German commanders reported being unable to concentrate forces for attacks because any concentration would immediately draw American artillery fire. German attempts to respond with counter-battery fire were increasingly futile as the campaign progressed. American artillery had developed sophisticated counter-battery procedures that integrated multiple intelligence sources. Sound-ranging units used sensitive microphones to triangulate the source of enemy gunfire. Flash spotting posts used surveyed observation positions to plot the location of muzzle flashes at night. Aerial observers in L-4 Cubs and fighter bombers reported any visible artillery. Prisoner interrogations provided information about unit locations and artillery positions. All of this intelligence flowed into fire direction centers that maintained detailed maps of known and suspected German artillery positions. When German guns fired, American intelligence systems detected them within seconds. The coordinates went immediately to counter-battery fire direction centers with highest priority. American doctrine called for immediate suppressive fire on any identified enemy artillery. German batteries firing more than a few rounds could expect American counter-battery fire within 3 to 5 minutes. The result was steady degradation of German artillery effectiveness. Wehrmacht batteries that revealed their positions by firing would be suppressed or destroyed. German artillery officers learned to fire brief missions and immediately displace, hoping to escape before counter-battery fire arrived. But displacement was time-consuming, especially for horse-drawn artillery, which still comprised the majority of German guns. Many batteries were caught and destroyed during displacement. Others avoided destruction only by severely limiting their activity, firing only a few rounds per day, and only when the tactical situation was desperate. The ammunition situation made German problems worse. By mid-1944, Allied air interdiction had devastated German logistics. Convoys and railroads were under constant attack. Ammunition production was declining as strategic bombing damaged factories and disrupted raw material supplies. German artillery batteries in Normandy operated under severe ammunition rationing. The Army Historical Foundation documents that German 5th Panzer Army artillery supporting operations in Normandy could fire only about 10% of the ammunition volume that British artillery fired in the same sector. The disparity was not due to fewer guns, but to lack of ammunition. German mobility was also inferior, and this disparity became more pronounced as the war continued. American artillery was completely motorized from the beginning of American involvement in the war. Every gun was towed by a truck or mounted on a self-propelled chassis. The standard prime mover for the 105mm M2A1 howitzer was the 2.5-ton 6x6 truck, commonly called the deuce and a half. These trucks could tow the howitzer at speeds up to 40 miles per hour on roads and could traverse rough terrain that would have been impossible for horse-drawn artillery. Heavier guns required more powerful prime movers. The 155mm M1 howitzer was typically towed by the M5 high-speed tractor, a tracked vehicle specifically designed for artillery towing. The M5 could move the heavy howitzer across virtually any terrain and could tow at speeds up to 35 miles per hour on roads. For the heaviest guns, including the 155mm M1917A1 gun, known as the Long Tom, and the 8-inch howitzer, the Army used the M4 high-speed tractor, an even more powerful tracked vehicle. American self-propelled artillery provided even greater mobility. The M7 Priest, mounting a 105mm howitzer on an M3 or M4 tank chassis, was the primary self-propelled artillery for armoured divisions. Each armoured division had 3 battalions of M7 Priests, a total of 54 howitzers that could move and fight with the division's tanks. The M7 could travel at road speeds up to 25 miles per hour and could traverse any terrain that tanks could cross. The crew could fire from the vehicle, and the M7 could displace under fire and continue firing from moving positions if necessary. The M12 gun motor carriage mounted a 155mm gun on a modified M3 tank chassis. Only 100 units were built initially, with 74 refurbished for the Normandy campaign. The M12 served as a bunker buster, capable of direct fire against fortified positions. During operations against the Siegfried Line fortifications in autumn 1944, M12 units were used to engage German bunkers with direct fire, penetrating 7 feet of reinforced concrete. The mobility of the M12 allowed these heavy guns to be brought forward quickly to engage targets that would have required days to reach with towed artillery. German artillery, in contrast, remained largely horse-drawn throughout the war. Germany mobilized approximately 2.75 million horses during World War II, and each infantry division used roughly 5,300 horses for artillery and logistics. A German artillery battery typically required 150 to 200 horses to move its 4 to 6 guns plus ammunition and support equipment. The horses required constant care, feeding, and rest. Each horse needed approximately 20 pounds of fodder per day, and providing this fodder in combat zones required substantial logistics effort. Horse-drawn artillery could move at most 25 kilometers per day under favorable conditions. In rain or mud, movement could be reduced to 10 kilometers per day or less. Hitching horses to guns, moving the battery, and unlimbering at a new position required 2 to 3 hours under good conditions. Under combat conditions, with enemy fire or poor visibility, the process could take much longer. The disparity between American motorized artillery that could displace in 15 minutes and move 50 kilometers in an hour versus German horse-drawn artillery that needed hours to move and could travel only limited distances per day was decisive. The horse dependence created other vulnerabilities. Horses were vulnerable to artillery fire, air attack, and disease. A battery that lost significant numbers of horses to enemy action might be immobilized for days until replacement horses could be brought forward. Artillery horses also required stable conditions for rest and feeding. Unlike trucks, which could be parked and ignored until needed, horses required constant attention. Artillery units had to allocate substantial personnel to horse care, reducing the number of men available for combat duties. The German attempt to mechanize their artillery in 1943 and 1944 came too late and never reached sufficient scale to offset the mobility advantage American forces enjoyed. Some German artillery units received half-track prime movers or captured vehicles, but the majority remained horse-drawn until the end of the war. German armoured and mechanized divisions had motorized or self-propelled artillery, but these elite units represented a small fraction of the German army. The bulk of German infantry divisions, and therefore the bulk of German artillery, depended on horses. The introduction of the proximity fuse in December 1944 multiplied American artillery effectiveness. The proximity fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver that measured the distance to the ground as the shell fell. When the shell reached optimal burst height, typically 15 to 20 meters above the surface, the fuse detonated the shell automatically. Every shell became an airburst without requiring complex time fuse calculations. The weapon had been developed in strict secrecy, beginning in 1940, and had been used for anti-aircraft defense and in Pacific Island operations, where unexploded rounds could not fall into enemy hands. But Pentagon officials had restricted ground use in Europe from fear that Germans might capture intact fuses from unexploded shells and reverse engineer the technology. The fear was that German development of countermeasures could devastate Allied bomber formations over Germany. The German Ardennes offensive in December 1944 changed the calculation. On December 16, 1944, as German forces smashed through American lines in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group used proximity-fused shells without authorization at Monschau, Germany. Axelson decided the emergency overrode the restrictions. His decision proved correct. The proximity-fused shells were devastatingly effective against attacking German infantry. General Dwight Eisenhower formally requested clearance to use proximity fuses in ground combat on December 19th. 2 days later, on December 21st, all restrictions were removed. Proximity-fused shells were rushed to the front. The effectiveness against troops in trenches and foxholes was dramatic. Positions that would have provided good protection against contact-fused shells, which detonate on ground impact, offered no protection against overhead airbursts. Proximity-fused shells increased casualties by an estimated factor of 3 to 4 compared to contact fuses. The psychological effect on German troops was severe. German tactical doctrine emphasized entrenchment and overhead cover as protection against artillery. Soldiers who had survived months of combat using proper field fortification techniques suddenly found those techniques ineffective. Some German soldiers reportedly refused to take cover during bombardments, reasoning they were as likely to be killed in a foxhole as standing in the open. Unit cohesion suffered as soldiers lost confidence in defensive procedures. The cumulative effect of American artillery superiority was crushing. Military historians estimate that approximately 70% of all ground combat casualties in World War II were caused by artillery and mortar fire. This statistic applies to casualties in general, not specifically to German losses, but the proportion was similar across all armies. The effectiveness of artillery as a casualty-producing weapon far exceeded that of small arms, tanks, or air attacks, and American artillery was the most effective artillery system in the war. The German army recognized American artillery superiority even while the war continued. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy until his injury in July 1944, noted in reports to Hitler that American artillery coordination was far superior to German capabilities. Rommel emphasized that Allied control of the air, combined with highly effective artillery, made German counterattacks extremely costly and usually unsuccessful. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, commented after the war on the effectiveness of American trucks in increasing Soviet artillery mobility on the Eastern Front. Von Manstein noted that Lend-Lease American trucks allowed Soviet artillery units to reposition rapidly, giving them mobility that German horse-drawn artillery could not match. The observation was doubly significant, implying that even Soviet artillery, which most observers considered inferior to American artillery in fire control sophistication, gained decisive advantage from American-supplied mobility. The American artillery system was not a single invention or a dramatic technological breakthrough. It was the product of systematic institutional development over 2 decades. Officers at Fort Sill had studied World War I, identified problems, developed solutions, tested procedures, and trained thousands of artillery officers in the new doctrine. The system worked because every element had been carefully designed to integrate with every other element. The system required excellent maps with standardized grid coordinates. American forces had such maps, supplied in vast quantities and distributed down to platoon level. The system required reliable radio communications. American artillery had powerful radios and maintained communications even under difficult conditions. The system required trained forward observers who could accurately locate targets and call for fire. American artillery trained observers extensively and embedded them with infantry units at company level. The system required accurate meteorological data because artillery fire is affected by wind, temperature, and air density. American artillery battalions had meteorological sections that provided regular weather updates. The system required survey teams to locate gun positions precisely. American artillery had survey sections in every battalion. The system required detailed firing tables and graphical firing tables. American artillery developed and produced these in quantity and supplied them to every fire direction center. Every element worked together. Remove any single element, and the system would degrade. But with all elements functioning, the system delivered precision, coordinated firepower that no other army could match. German soldiers in foxholes facing that system learned to fear the sound of the Piper Cub engine overhead because they knew that sound meant death was 3 minutes away. The Americans did not develop their artillery system because they were smarter or braver than their opponents. They developed it because they recognized the problem, dedicated resources to solving it, and built institutions that could train soldiers and maintain equipment to execute the doctrine. The German army had excellent artillery officers who understood fire control problems as well as Americans did. But German military resources in the interwar period were constrained by the Versailles Treaty, and when rearmament began in the 1930s, German doctrine emphasized tanks and close air support for mobile warfare. Artillery was important, but not the main focus. The Soviets had their own artillery doctrine based on mass and overwhelming firepower. Soviet artillery was effective in the massive battles of the Eastern Front, where targets were large and precision was less critical than volume. The Soviet approach worked for Soviet operational requirements. British artillery developed in different directions, emphasizing deliberate fire planning and systematic preparation. British artillery was highly effective and respected by German opponents, but only the Americans combined speed, precision, flexibility, and overwhelming firepower into a single integrated system optimized for rapid response and continuous adaptation to fluid tactical situations. The Fire Direction Center system allowed American artillery to function like a single weapon with hundreds of barrels, all controlled by a single mind, capable of massing devastating fire anywhere within range, within minutes of a target being identified. Major General Carlos Brewer, who pioneered much of the early doctrine, retired from the army in 1946. He had commanded the 12th Armored Division during training but was not permitted to lead it in combat due to his age. He requested reduction in rank to colonel so he could serve as an artillery officer in Europe. He served on corps artillery staffs during 1944 and 45, advising on fire control procedures and helping coordinate the massive artillery concentrations that supported Allied offensives. After the war, he returned to Kentucky, managed a small farm, and never sought publicity for his role in developing artillery doctrine. He died in 1976 at age 85. Major General Orlando Ward, who developed the Fire Direction Center concept, had a longer military career. He commanded the 1st Armored Division in North Africa and later served as commandant of the Field Artillery School during World War II. After the war, he remained in the army and eventually retired as a lieutenant general. He wrote extensively about combined arms, operations, and artillery employment, publishing articles in professional military journals. He died in 1972 at age 79. His papers are archived at the Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. Neither Brewer nor Ward received widespread public recognition for their contributions. No monuments were built, no popular histories told their stories. The official histories of World War II artillery credit the Field Artillery School generally, and mention many individuals, but Brewer and Ward appear primarily in specialized military publications rather than popular accounts. Yet their work saved thousands of American and Allied lives by enabling artillery to suppress enemy forces so effectively that infantry and armor could advance with reduced casualties. And their system killed tens of thousands of Axis soldiers who had no effective defense against precision-coordinated fire. The Fire Direction Center concept spread throughout the American military and became standard NATO doctrine after the war. The Soviets developed their own version of centralized fire control, though it remained less flexible than the American system. Modern artillery fire direction is directly descended from the concepts developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s and refined through World War II. Digital computers have replaced graphical firing tables, and GPS has replaced survey techniques, but the fundamental concept remains unchanged. Centralized control, pre-computed data, rapid coordination of multiple batteries, flexible allocation of fire support assets. The story of American artillery superiority in World War II is not a story of individual heroism, though individual artillerymen certainly performed heroically. It is not a story of technological miracles, though the proximity fuse and other innovations were important. It is a story of systematic institutional development, of doctrine written carefully in peacetime by officers thinking about future wars, of training programs that drilled procedures until they became automatic, of logistics systems that supplied millions of shells to thousands of guns operating continuously for months. It is a story of communications networks that kept artillery coordinated even under the chaos of combat, of maps and surveys and meteorological data and firing tables all prepared in advance so that when combat began, the system would work, of thousands of officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted soldiers who learned their roles and executed them professionally under intense pressure. The German army had excellent artillery equipment and skilled crews. But Germany did not have a system. German artillery operated battery by battery, with limited coordination and no centralized control capable of rapidly massing corps-level fires against targets of opportunity. When German artillery faced an enemy with a true integrated artillery system, backed by the largest industrial economy in the world, German guns were simply overwhelmed. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. American artillery fired its last combat missions that morning, suppressing scattered German resistance in Czechoslovakia and Austria. The guns fell silent. Forward observers packed their radios. Fire direction centers shut down their plotting boards. The system that had broken so many German attacks, that had enabled Allied victory at acceptable cost in casualties, stopped operating. But it did not disappear. The doctrine survived. The training survived. The institutional knowledge survived. When American artillery went to war again in Korea, in Vietnam, In the Persian Gulf and Iraq, the system worked, the weapons changed, the technology improved, but the fundamental concept remained. Centralized fire direction, rapid response, flexible coordination, massed fires delivered with precision against any target within range. That is how wars are won. Not through spectacular battles or individual acts of courage, though those matter. Wars are won through logistics, training, doctrine, and systematic execution. Through officers in classrooms developing procedures, technicians maintaining equipment, logisticians moving supplies, and soldiers executing their tasks professionally under pressure. Through the thousands of unglamorous activities that make military systems function effectively. American artillery in World War II worked because the system had been carefully designed, thoroughly tested, properly resourced, and professionally executed. German soldiers facing that system learned that there was no defense. They could dig deeper, move faster, hide better, but when the Piper Cub appeared overhead, artillery fire would arrive with mathematical precision. That certainty, that inescapability, that mechanical efficiency of death from above broke the Wehrmacht's ability to fight effectively in Western Europe. Not tanks, not air power, artillery. The weapon that the Americans had perfected through years of careful development. The weapon that gave no warning, offered no escape, and demonstrated that modern war is won by systems and institutions rather than individual